How a temporary law became permanent power. It was introduced as a short-term fix, a narrow response to an urgent problem that leaders promised would fade once stability returned. No one imagined it would still be shaping daily life years later. But temporary power has a way of settling in. This story matters today because emergency laws are rarely remembered for how they begin, but for how quietly they remain. What is meant to solve a moment often reshapes the future far beyond its original purpose. The pattern is consistent across history. Extraordinary authority is granted in response to extraordinary circumstances, and once the circumstances pass, the authority remains, defended by those who have adapted to it and forgotten by those who originally consented to it. At the time, the country faced mounting pressure, public fear, political paralysis, and demands for decisive action that could not wait for lengthy debate. Leaders framed the law as necessary, limited, and tightly controlled, assuring the public that normal rules would soon return. The framing was essential to its acceptance. By presenting extraordinary power as bounded and temporary, leaders lowered the threshold of consent. Citizens who would have resisted permanent authority accepted temporary authority because the promise of expiration made the trade-off seem manageable. The language was careful and calming. Safeguards were promised, timelines were mentioned, and oversight was described as sufficient to prevent abuse. Each of these assurances served a specific function. Safeguards addressed concerns about overreach. Timelines addressed concerns about permanence. Oversight addressed concerns about accountability. Together, they created a comprehensive narrative of responsible governance that made the law appear safe to support. Most citizens accepted the measure, not because they desired more control, but because uncertainty felt more dangerous than authority. Stability, even borrowed, felt worth the trade. The psychological dynamic at work was the asymmetry between immediate fear and distant concern. The crisis was present, tangible, and emotionally compelling. The risk of permanent power was abstract, hypothetical, and emotionally muted. In any contest between the two, immediate fear wins. At first, the law worked as intended. Order improved, decision-making accelerated, and the crisis appeared contained. The short-term results validated the decision and created a narrative of success that would later be used to justify extension. But something subtle had changed. Power had moved, and once it moves, it rarely returns on its own. The redistribution of authority that the law enabled was not merely procedural. It was structural. New pathways of decision-making had been created, new habits of governance had formed, and new expectations about the speed and scope of executive action had been established. This was the beginning of permanence disguised as necessity. As the immediate crisis faded, the law did not disappear with it, because removing it felt riskier than keeping it in place. What had been justified by urgency was now defended by convenience. The argument shifted seamlessly from necessity to utility. The law was no longer needed to address the original crisis, but it was useful for addressing subsequent challenges. And the precedent of its effectiveness made it easier to retain than to repeal. Institutions adapted around the new authority, rewriting procedures and expectations so thoroughly that normal governance began to depend on extraordinary powers. The adaptation was organic and uncoordinated. Individual departments and agencies adjusted their workflows to accommodate the expanded authority, and over time, those adjusted workflows became the baseline. The extraordinary became ordinary through the accumulated weight of daily practice. Oversight weakened not through removal, but through exhaustion, as repeated extensions normalized what was once exceptional. The oversight bodies that had been established to monitor the law's use gradually shifted from active scrutiny to routine approval. Each extension required less debate than the last, and the burden of proof shifted from those seeking extension to those opposing it. Each renewal required less explanation than the last, because the law had become familiar, and familiarity reduces resistance. The psychological mechanism was straightforward. Novelty triggers evaluation. Familiarity triggers acceptance. By the time the law had been renewed several times, it no longer registered as extraordinary in the public or institutional consciousness. Officials cited efficiency and stability as proof of success, even as transparency declined and decision-making moved further from public view. The metrics by which the law was evaluated shifted over time. Initially, it was measured against the crisis it was designed to address. Later, it was measured against the operational efficiency it provided. The change in metric was itself a form of normalization, as the law was no longer evaluated by its original purpose, but by its ongoing utility. Those who questioned permanence were told the risk of reversal was too high, that returning power would invite chaos or undo progress. This argument created a ratchet effect. Each extension made the system more dependent on extraordinary authority, which in turn made the argument against reversal stronger. The longer the law remained, the more disruptive its removal would be. And the more disruptive its removal would be, the stronger the case for keeping it. The public adjusted quietly, trading participation for predictability, often without noticing how much leverage had been surrendered. The trade was never explicit. No citizen consciously chose to exchange democratic participation for administrative efficiency. The exchange occurred gradually, through a series of small accommodations that individually seemed reasonable but collectively constituted a significant transfer of authority. What began as protection was now infrastructure, embedded into governance in ways that made removal disruptive rather than restorative. The law was no longer temporary in practice, only in language, and language was all that still separated power from permanence. The conflict emerged when the permanent effects of the law became impossible to ignore, revealing how emergency power had reshaped accountability. Decisions once debated openly were now issued as directives, justified by precedent rather than necessity. The deliberative processes that had once preceded major decisions had been bypassed so consistently that their absence was no longer noticed by most participants in the system. Legal challenges struggled to gain traction because the law had rewritten the framework used to judge its own legitimacy. The judicial system, which might have served as a check on the law's expansion, found itself operating within a legal landscape that the law itself had shaped. Challenging the law required arguments grounded in principles that the law had functionally displaced. Public trust eroded as citizens realized that what they accepted temporarily had altered the balance between authority and consent. The erosion was not sudden. It accumulated through repeated encounters with a system that felt less responsive, less transparent, and less accountable than the one citizens remembered consenting to. Attempts to repeal the law faced resistance from those who benefited from its efficiency and control. The constituency for the law's continuation was larger and more organized than the constituency for repeal, because those who benefited from the status quo had concrete interests to protect, while those who sought change had only abstract principles to invoke. The buildup intensified when a new crisis exposed how dependent governance had become on extraordinary powers. What was once an exception was now the default response. The system had adapted around permanence, leaving little room for reversal without disruption. Power had not been seized. It had been extended, normalized, and absorbed, and that made it hard to confront. The climax arrived when it became clear that the temporary law had outlived both the crisis and the consent that created it. What remained was authority without urgency, power without expiration. There was no dramatic takeover to oppose, no single moment to resist. The system had changed through acceptance rather than force. The resolution lies in recognizing that emergency powers demand constant review, not gratitude. What saves a moment can slowly redefine a system. This story matters today because extraordinary authority continues to expand quietly whenever fear outweighs vigilance. History shows that power rarely returns willingly once stability depends on it. The lesson is not rejection of action, but insistence on limits. Temporary must truly mean temporary, or it becomes permanent by default. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. How